The Art of War by Niccolò Machiavelli.
Book 5, Part 2. Zenobie said, "I believe, as you say, that these arrangements are very necessary, and by myself I would not know what to add or leave out. It is true that I desire to know two things from you. The one, when you want to make a front from the rear or from a flank, and you want them to turn, whether the command is given by voice or by sound or bugle call. The other, whether those you sent ahead to clear the roads in order to make a path for the army ought to be soldiers of your companies, or other lowly people assigned to such practices." Fabrizio said, "Your first question is very important, for often the commands of the captain, not very well understood or poorly interpreted, have disorganized their army. Hence the voices with which they command in times of danger ought to be loud and clear. And if you command with sounds or bugle calls, it ought to be done so that they are so different from each other that one cannot be mistaken for another. And if you command by voice, you ought to be alert to avoid general words, and use particular ones. And of the particular ones, avoid those which might be able to be interpreted in an incorrect manner. Many times saying, 'Go back, go back,' has caused an army to be ruined. Therefore this expression ought to be avoided, and in its place use 'retreat.' If you want them to turn so as to change the front, either from the rear or from the flank, never use 'turn around,' but say 'to the left, to the right, to the rear, to the front.' So, too, all the other words have to be simple and clear, as 'hurry,' 'hold still,' 'forward,' 'return.' And all those things which can be done by words are done. The others are done by sounds or calls. As to the road clearers, which is your second question, I would have this job done by my own soldiers, as much because the ancient military did so, as also because there would be fewer unarmed men and less impediments in the army. And I would draw the number needed from every company, and I would have them take up the tools suitable for clearing, and leave their arms in those ranks that are closest to them, which would carry them so that if the enemy should come, they would have nothing to do but take them up again and return to their ranks." Zenobie said, "Who would carry the clearing equipment?" Fabrizio said, "The wagons assigned to carry such equipment." Zenobie said, "I'm afraid you have never led these soldiers of ours to dig." Fabrizio said, "Everything will be discussed in its place. For now I want to leave these parts alone, and discuss the manner of living of the army. For it appears to me that, having worked them so hard, it is time to refresh and restore them with food. You have to understand that a prince ought to organize his army as expeditiously as possible, and take away from it all those things that add burdens to it, and make the enterprise difficult. Among those that cause more difficulty are to have to keep the army provided with wine and baked bread. The ancients did not think of wine, for lacking it they drank water tinted with a little vinegar, and not wine. They did not cook bread in ovens, as is customary throughout the cities, but they provided flour, and every soldier satisfied himself of that in his own way, having lard and grease for condiment, which gave flavour to the bread they made, and which kept them strong. So that the provisions of eating for the army were flour, vinegar, bacon, and lard, and barley for the horses. Ordinarily they had herds of large and small beasts that followed the army, which, as they did not need to be carried, did not impede them much. This arrangement permitted an ancient army to march sometimes for many days through solitary and difficult places without suffering hardship for lack of provisions, for it lived from things which could be drawn behind. The contrary happens in modern armies, which, as they do not want to lack wine and eat baked bread in the manner of those at home do, and of which they cannot make provision for long, often are hungry. Or, even if they are provided, it is done with hardship and at very great expense. I would, therefore, return an army to this form of living, and I would not have them eat other bread than that which they cook for themselves. As to wine, I would not prohibit its drinking, or that it should come into the army, but I would not use either industry or hard work to obtain it. And as to other provisions, I would govern myself entirely as the ancients. If you would consider this matter well, you will see how much difficulty is removed, and how many troubles and hardships an army and a captain avoid, and what great advantage it will give any enterprise which you want to undertake." Zenobie said, "We have overcome the enemy in the field, and then marched on his country. Reason wants that there be no booty, ransoming of towns, prisoners taken. Yet I would like to know how the ancients governed themselves in these matters." Fabrizio said, "Here I will satisfy you. I believe you have considered, since I have at another time discussed this with some of you, that modern wars impoverish as much those lords who win as those who lose. For if one loses the state, the other loses his money and movable possessions, which anciently did not happen, as the winner of a war then was enriched. This arises from not keeping track in these times of the booty acquired, as was done anciently, but everything is left to the direction of the soldiers. This method makes for two very great disorders: the one, that of which I have spoken; the other, that a soldier becomes more desirous of booty and less an observer of orders. And it has often been said that the cupidity for booty has made him lose who has been victorious. The Romans, however, who were princes in this matter, provided for both these inconveniences, ordering that all the booty belonged to the public, and that hence the public should dispense it as it pleased. And so they had quaestors in the army, who were, as we would say, chamberlains, to whom all the ransoms and booty was given to hold, from which the consul served himself to give the soldiers their regular pay, to help the wounded and infirm, and to provide for the other needs of the army. The consul could indeed, and often did, concede a booty to the soldiers, but this concession did not cause disorders. For when the enemy army was routed, all the booty was placed in the middle, and was distributed to each person according to the merits of each. This method made for the soldiers attending to winning and not robbing, and the Roman legions defeating the enemy but not pursuing him, for they never departed from their orders. Only the cavalry and lightly armed men pursued him, unless there were other soldiers than legionaries, which, if the booty would have been kept by whoever acquired it, it was neither possible nor reasonable to expect to hold the legion firm, and would bring on many dangers. From this it resulted, therefore, that the public was enriched, and every consul brought, with his triumphs, much treasure into the treasury, which constituted entirely of ransoms and booty. Another thing well considered by the ancients was the pay they gave to each soldier. They wanted a third part to be placed next to him who carried the flag of the company, who never was given any except that furnished by the war. They did this for two reasons. The first, so that the soldier would make capital and save some of his pay. For the greater part of them being young and irresponsible, the more they had, the more they spent without need to. The other part because, knowing that their movable possessions were next to the flag, they would be forced to have greater care and defend it with greater obstinacy, and thus this method made them savers and strong. All of these things are necessary to observe if you want to bring the military up to your standards." Zenobie said, "I believe it is not possible for an army, while marching from place to place, not to encounter dangerous incidents, and where the industry of the captain and the virtue of the soldier is needed if they are to be avoided. Therefore, if you should have something that occurs to you, I would take care to listen." Fabrizio said, "I will willingly content you, especially as it is necessary if I want to give you complete knowledge of the practice. The captains, while they march with the army, ought above everything else to guard against ambushes, which may happen in two ways. Either you enter into them while marching, or the enemy cunningly draws you into them without your being aware of it. In the first case, if you want to avoid them, it is necessary to send ahead double the guard, who reconnoitre the country. And the more the country is suitable for ambush, as are wooded and mountainous countries, the more diligence ought to be used, for the enemy always place themselves either in woods or behind a hill. And just as by not foreseeing an ambush you will be ruined, so by foreseeing it you will not be harmed. Birds or dust have often discovered the enemy, for where the enemy comes to meet you he will always raise a great dust, which will point out his coming to you. Thus often a captain, when he sees in a place whence he ought to pass pigeons taking off, and other birds flying about freely, circling and not settling, has recognized this to be the place of an enemy ambush, and knowing this, has sent his forces forward, saving himself and injuring the enemy. As to the second case, being drawn into it, which our men call being drawn into a trap, you ought to look out not to believe readily those things that appear to be less reasonable than they should be, as would be the case if an enemy places some booty before you. You would believe it to be an act of love, but would conceal deceit inside it. If many enemies are driven out by few of your men, if only a few of the enemy assault you, if the enemy takes to sudden and unreasonable flight, in such cases you ought always to be afraid of deceit. And you should never believe that the enemy does not know his business. Rather, if you want to deceive yourself less, and bring on less danger, the more he appears weak, the more the enemy appears more cautious, so much the more ought you to be wary of him. And in this you have to use two different means, since you have to fear him with your thoughts and arrangements, but by words and other external demonstrations show him how much you disparage him. For this latter method causes your soldiers to have more hope in obtaining the victory. The former makes you more cautious and less apt to be deceived. And you have to understand that when you march through enemy country, you face more and greater dangers than in undertaking an engagement. And therefore, when marching, a captain ought to double his diligence, and the first thing he ought to do is to have all the country through which he marches described and depicted, so that he will know the places, the numbers, the distances, the roads, the mountains, the rivers, the marshes, and all their characteristics. And in getting to know this, in divers ways, one must have around him different people who know the places, and question them with diligence, and contrast their information, and make notes according as it checks out. He ought to send cavalry ahead, and with them prudent heads, not so much to discover the enemy as to reconnoitre the country, to see whether it checks with the places and with the information received from them. He ought also to send out guides, guarded and kept loyal by hopes of reward and fear of punishment. And above all, he ought to see to it that the army does not know to which sides he guides them, since there is nothing more useful in war than to keep silent about the things that have to be done. And so that a sudden assault does not disturb your soldiers, you ought to advise them to be prepared with their arms, since things that are foreseen cause less harm. Many have, in order to avoid the confusion of the march, placed the wagons and the unarmed men under the banners, and commanded them to follow them, so that having to stop or retire during the march, they are able to do so more easily, which I approve very much as something useful. He ought also to have an awareness during the march that one part of the army does not detach itself from another, or that one part going faster and the other more slowly, the army does not become compacted, which things cause disorganization. It is necessary, therefore, to place the heads along the sides, who should maintain the steps uniform, restraining those who are too fast and hastening the slow, which step cannot be better regulated than by sound. The roads ought to be widened, so that at least one company can always move in order. The customs and characteristics of the enemy ought to be considered, and if he wants to assault you in the morning, noon, or night, and if he is more powerful in infantry or cavalry, from what you have learned you may organize and prepare yourself. But let us come to some incident in particular. It sometimes happens that, as you are taking yourself away from in front of the enemy, because you judge yourself to be inferior to him, and therefore do not want to come to an engagement with him, he comes upon your rear as you arrive at the banks of a river, which causes you to lose time in its crossing, so that the enemy is about to join up and combat with you. There have been some who have found themselves in such peril, their army girded on the rear side by a ditch, and filling it with tow, have set it afire. Then they have passed on with the army without being able to be impeded by the enemy, he being stopped by that fire which was in between. Zenobi said, "And it is hard for me to believe that this fire can check him, especially as I remember to have heard that Hanno the Carthaginian, when he was besieged by the enemy, girded himself on that side from which he wanted to make an eruption with wood, and set fire to it. Whence the enemy, not being intent to guard that side, had his army pass over the flames, having each soldier protect his face from the fire and smoke with his shield." Fabrizio said, "You say well, but consider what I have said, and what Hanno did. For I said that he dug a ditch and filled it with tow, so that whoever wanted to pass had to contend with the ditch and the fire. Hanno made the fire without a ditch, and, as he wanted to pass through it, did not make it very large or strong, since it would have impeded him even without the ditch. Do you not know that Nabonidus the Spartan, when he was besieged in Sparta by the Romans, set fire to part of his own town in order to stop the passage of the Romans, who had already entered inside, and by those flames not only stopped their passage, but pushed them out? But let us return to our subject. Quintus Lutatius, the Roman, having the Cimbri at his rear, and arriving at a river, so that the enemy should give him time to cross, made as if to give him time to combat him, and therefore feigned to make camp there, and had ditches dug, and some pavilions raised, and sent some horses to the camps to be shod, so that the Cimbri, believing he was encamping, they also encamped, and divided themselves into several parts to provide themselves with food, of which Lutatius, becoming aware, he crossed the river without being able to be impeded by them. Some, in order to cross a river, not having a bridge, have diverted it, and having drawn a part of it in their rear, the other then became so low that they crossed it easily. If the rivers are rapid, and desiring that the infantry should cross more safely, the more capable horses are placed on the side above which holds back the water, and another part below which succour the infantry, if any, in crossing, should be overcome by the river. Rivers that are not forded are crossed by bridges, boats, and rafts, and it is therefore well to have skills in your armies capable of doing all these things. It sometimes happens that in crossing a river the enemy on the opposite bank impedes you. If you want to overcome this difficulty, there is no better example than that of Caesar, who, having his army on the bank of a river in Gaul, and his crossing being impeded by Vercingetorix the Gaul, who had his forces on the other side of the river, marched for several days along the river, and the enemy did the same. And Caesar, having made an encampment in a woody place, and suitable to conceal his forces, withdrew 3 cohorts from every legion, and had them stop in that place, commanding then that as soon as he should depart they should throw a bridge across and fortify it, and he with the rest of his forces continued the march. Whence Vercingetorix, seeing the number of legions, and believing that no part had remained behind, also continued the march. But Caesar, as soon as he thought the bridge had been completed, turned back, and finding everything in order, crossed the river without difficulty. Zenobi said, "Do you have any rule for recognizing the fords?" Fabrizio said, "Yes, we have. The river, in that part between the stagnant water and the current, always looks like a line to whoever looks at it, is shallower, and is a place more suitable for fording than elsewhere. For the river always places more material, and in a pack, which it draws with it from the bottom, which thing, as it has been experienced many times, is very true." Zenobi said, "If it happens that the river has washed away the bottom of the ford, so that horses sink, what remedy do you have?" Fabrizio said, "Make grids of wood, and place them on the bottom of the river, and cross over those. But let us pursue our discussion. If it happens that a captain with his army is caught between 2 mountains, and has but 2 ways of saving himself, either that in front or the one in the rear, and both being occupied by the enemy, has as a remedy to do what some have done in the past, which is to dig a large ditch difficult to cross, and show the enemy that by it you want to be able to hold him with all his forces, without having to fear those forces in the rear, for which the road in front remains open. The enemy, believing this, fortifies himself on the side open, and abandons the side closed, which he then throws a wooden bridge, planned for such a result, over the ditch, and without any impediment passes on that side, and freed himself from the hands of the enemy. Lucius Minutius, the Roman consul, was in Liguria with the armies, and had been enclosed between certain mountains by the enemy, from which he could not go out. He therefore sent some soldiers of Numidia, whom he had in his army, who were badly armed and mounted on small and scrawny horses, towards those places which were guarded by the enemy, and the first sight of whom caused the enemy to assemble to defend the pass. But when they saw those forces poorly organized and also poorly mounted, they esteemed them little, and loosed their guard. As soon as the Numidians saw this, giving spurs to their horses and attacking them, they passed by without the enemy being able to take any remedy. And having passed, they wasted and plundered the country, constraining the enemy to leave the pass free to the army of Lucius. Some captain who has found himself assaulted by a great multitude of the enemy has tightened his ranks and given the enemy the faculty of completely surrounding him, and then has applied force to that part which he has recognized as being weaker, and has made a path in that way, and saved himself. Marcantonio, while retiring before the army of the Parthians, became aware that every day at daybreak, as he moved, the enemy assaulted him, and infested him throughout the march, so that he took the course of not departing before midday, so that the Parthians, believing he should not want to decamp that day, returned to their quarters, and Marcantonio was able then for the remainder of the day to march without being molested. This same man, to escape the darts of the Parthians, commanded that when the Parthians came towards them, they should kneel, and the second rank of the company should place their shields on the heads of those in the first, the third on those of the second, the fourth on the third, and so on successively, so that the entire army came to be as under a roof, and protected from the darts of the enemy. This is as much as occurs to me to tell of what can happen to an army when marching. Therefore, if nothing else occurs to you, we'll pass on to another part. End of Book 5. Book 6, Part 1 of The Art of War. Zenobi said, "I believe it is well, since the discussion ought to be changed, that Batista take up his office, and I resign mine. And in this case we would come to imitate the good captains, according as I have already learned here from the Lord, who place the best soldiers in the front and in the rear of the army, as it appears necessary to them to have those who bravely enkindle the battle, and those in the rear who bravely sustain it. Cosimo, therefore, begun this discussion prudently, and Batista will prudently finish it. Luigi and I have come in between these, and as each of one of us has taken up his part willingly, so too I believe Batista is about to close it." Batista said, "I have allowed myself to be governed up to now. So, too, I will allow myself to be governed in the future. Be content, therefore, my lords, to continue your discussions, and if we interrupt you with these questions, you have to excuse us." Fabrizio said, "You do me, as I have already told you, a very great favour, since these interruptions of yours do not take away my imagination, rather they refresh it. But if we want to pursue our subject, I say that it is now time that we quarter this army of ours, since you know that everything desires repose and safety, since to repose oneself and not to repose safely is not complete repose. I am afraid, indeed, that you should not desire that I first quarter them, then had them march, and lastly to fight. And we have done the contrary. Necessity has led us to this. For in wanting to show when marching how an army turns from a marching formation to that of battle, it was necessary first to show how they were organized for battle. But returning to our subject, I say that if you want the encampment to be safe, it must be strong and organized. The industry of the captain makes it organized. Arts or the sight make it strong. The Greeks sought strong locations, and never took positions where there was neither caves or banks of rivers, or a multitude of trees, or other natural cover which should protect them. But the Romans did not encamp safely so much from the location as by arts, nor ever made an encampment in places where they should not have been able to spread out all their forces according to their discipline. From this resulted that the Romans were always able to have one form of encampment, for they wanted the site to obey them, and not they the site. The Greeks were not able to observe this, for as they obeyed the site, and the sites changing the formation, it behooved them that they too should change the mode of encamping and the form of their encampment. The Romans, therefore, where the site lacked strength, supplied it with their art and industry. And since in this narration of mine I have wanted that the Romans be imitated, I will not depart from their mode of encamping, not, however, observing all their arrangements, but taking only that part which at the present time seems appropriate to me. I have often told you that the Romans had 2 legions of Roman men in their consular armies, which comprised some 11,000 infantry of forces sent by friends or allies to aid them. But they never had more foreign soldiers in their armies than Romans, except for cavalry, which they did not care if they exceeded the number in their legions, and that in every action of theirs they placed the legions in the centre and the auxiliaries on the sides, which method they observed even when they encamped, as you yourselves have been able to read in those who write of their affairs. And therefore I am not about to narrate in detail how they encamped, but will tell you only how I would at present arrange to encamp an army, and then you will know what part of the Roman methods I have treated. You know that at the encounter of 2 Roman legions I have taken 2 battalions of 6,000 infantry and 300 cavalry effective for each battalion, and I have divided them by companies, by arms and names. You know that in organizing the army for marching and fighting I have not made mention of other forces, but have only shown that in doubling the forces nothing else to be done but to double the orders or arrangements. Since at present I want to show you the manner of encamping, it appears proper to me not to stay only with 2 battalions, but to assemble a fair army, and composed like the Roman of 2 battalions and as many auxiliary forces. I know that the form of an encampment is more perfect when a complete army is quartered, which matter did not appear necessary to me in the previous demonstration. If I want, therefore, to quarter a fair-sized army of 24,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry effectives, being divided into 4 companies, 2 of your own forces and 2 of foreigners, I would employ this method. When I had found the site where I should want to encamp, I would raise the captain's flag, and around it I would draw a square which would have each face distant from it 50 arm lengths, of which each should look out onto one of the 4 regions of the sky, that is, east, west, south, and north, in which space I would put the quarters of the captain. And as I believe it prudent, and because thus the Romans did in good part, I would divide the armed men from the unarmed, and separate the men who carry burdens from the unburdened ones. I would quarter all or a great part of the armed men on the east side, and the unarmed and burdened ones on the west side, making the east the front and the west the rear of the encampment, and the south and north would be the flanks. And to distinguish the quarters of the armed men I would employ this method. I would run a line from the captain's flag, and would lead it easterly for a distance of 680 arm lengths. I would also run 2 other lines, which I would place in the middle of it, and be of the same length as the former, but distant from each of them by 15 arm lengths, at the extremity of which I would want the east gate to be placed. And the space which exists between the 2 lines I would make a road that would go from the gate to the quarters of the captain, which would be 30 arm lengths in width and 630 long, since the captain's quarters would occupy 50 arm lengths, and call this the captain's way. I would then make another road from the south gate up to the north gate, and cross by the head of the captain's way, and along the east side of the captain's quarters, which would be 1,250 arm lengths long, since it would occupy the entire width of the encampment, and also be 30 arm lengths wide, and be called the crossway. The quarters of the captain, and these two roads having been designed, therefore the quarters of the 2 battalions of your own men should begin to be designed. And I would quarter one on the right-hand side of the captain's way, and one on the left. And hence, beyond the space which is occupied by the width of the crossway, I would place 32 quarters on the left side of the captain's way, and 32 on the right, leaving a space of 30 arm lengths between the 16th and 17th quarters, which should serve as a transverse road, which should cross through all of the quarters of the battalions, as will be seen in their partitioning. Of these two arrangements of quarters, in the first tents that would be adjacent to the crossway, I would quarter the heads of men-at-arms, and since each company has 150 men-at-arms, there would be assigned 10 men-at-arms to each of the quarters. The area of the quarters of the heads should be 40 arm lengths wide and 10 arm lengths long. And it is to be noted that whenever I say width, I mean from south to north, and when I say length, that from west to east. Those of the men-at-arms should be 15 arm lengths long and 30 wide. In the next 15 quarters, which in all cases are next, which should have their beginning across the transverse road, and which would have the same space as those of the men-at-arms, I would quarter the light cavalry, which, since they are 150, 10 cavalrymen would be assigned to each quarter, and in the 16th, which would be left, I would quarter their head, giving him the same space which is given to the head of men-at-arms. And thus the quarters of the cavalry of the 2 battalions would come to place the captain's way in the centre, and give a rule for the quarters of the infantry, as I will narrate. You have noted that I have quartered 300 cavalry of each battalion, with their heads in 32 quarters situated on the captain's way, and beginning with the crossway, and that from the 16th to the 17th, there is a space of 30 arm lengths to make a transverse road. If I want, therefore, to quarter the 20 companies which constitute the 2 regular battalions, I would place the quarters of every 2 companies behind the quarters of the cavalry, each of which should be 15 arm lengths long and 30 wide, as those of the cavalry, and should be joined on the rear where they touch one another. And in every first quarter of each band that fronts on the crossway, I would quarter the constable of one company, which would come to correspond with the quartering of the head of the men-at-arms, and their quarters alone would have a space 20 arm lengths in width and 10 in length. And in the other 15 quarters in each group, which follow after this up the transverse way, I would quarter a company of infantry on each side, which, as they are 450, 30 would be assigned to each quarter. I would place the other 15 quarters contiguous in each group to those of the cavalry with the same space, in which I would quarter a company of infantry from each group. In the last quarter of each group I would place the constable of the company, who would come to be adjacent to the head of the light cavalry, with a space of 10 arm lengths long and 20 wide. And thus these first 2 rows of quarters would be half of cavalry and half of infantry. And as I want, as I told you in its place, these cavalry to be all effective, and hence without retainers who help taking care of the horses or other necessary things, I would want these infantry quartered behind the cavalry should be obligated to help the owners of the horses in providing and taking care of them, and because of this should be exempt from other activities of the camp, which was the manner observed by the Romans. I would also leave behind these quarters, on all sides, a space of 30 arm lengths to make a road, and I would call one the first road on the right-hand side, and the other the first road on the left, and in each area I would place another row of 32 double quarters, which should face one another on the rear, with the same spaces as those which I have mentioned, and also divided at the 16th in the same manner to create a transverse road, in which I would quarter in each area 4 companies of infantry with the constables on the front at the head and foot of each row. I would also leave on each side another space of 30 arm lengths to create a road which would be called the second road on the right-hand side, and on the other side the second road to the left. I would place another row in each area of 32 double quarters with the same distances and divisions, in which I would quarter on every side 4 companies of infantry with their constables. And thus there would come to be quartered in each 3 rows of quarters per area the cavalry and the companies of infantry of the 2 regular battalions, in the centre of which I would place the captain's way. The 2 battalions of auxiliaries, since I had them composed of the same men, I would quarter on each side of these 2 regular battalions with the same arrangement of double quarters, placing first a row of quarters in which I would quarter half the cavalry and half infantry, distant 30 arm lengths from each other, to create 2 roads which I should call one the third road on the right-hand side, the other the third road on the left-hand. And then I would place on each side 2 other rows of quarters, separate but arranged in the same way as those of the regular battalions, which would create 2 other roads, and all of these would be called by the number and the band where they should be situated, so that all this part of the army would come to be quartered in 12 rows of double quarters, and on 13 roads, counting the captain's way and the crossway. I would want a space of 100 arm lengths all around left between the quarters and the ditch or moat. And if you count all those spaces, you will see that from the middle of the quarters of the captain to the east gate there are 700 arm lengths. There remains to us now 2 spaces, of which one is from the quarters of the captain to the south gate, the other from there to the north gate, each of which comes to be, measuring from the centre point, 635 arm lengths. I then subtract from each of these spaces 50 arm lengths, which the quarters of the captain occupies, and 45 arm lengths of plaza, which I want to give to each side, and 30 arm lengths of road, which divides each of the mentioned spaces in the middle, and 100 arm lengths which are left on each side between the quarters and the ditch, and there remains in each area a space left for quarters 400 arm lengths wide and 100 long, measuring the length to include the space occupied by the captain's quarters. Dividing the said length in the middle, therefore, there would be on each side of the captain 40 quarters, 50 arm lengths long and 20 wide, which would total 80 quarters, in which would be quartered the general heads of the battalions, the chamberlains, the masters of the camps, and all those who should have an office in the army, leaving some vacant for some foreigners who might arrive, and for those who should fight through the courtesy of the captain. On the rear side of the captain's quarters I would create a road 30 arm lengths wide from north to south, and call it the front road, which would come to be located along the 80 quarters mentioned, since this road and the crossway would have between them the captain's quarters and the 80 quarters on their flanks. From this front road, and opposite to the captain's quarters, I would create another road which would go from there to the west gate, also 30 arm lengths wide, and corresponding in location and length to the captain's way, and I would call it the way of the plaza. These 2 roads being located, I would arrange the plaza where the market should be made, which I would place at the head of the way of the plaza, opposite to the captain's quarters, and next to the front road, and would want it to be square, and would allow it 121 arm lengths per side. And from the right hand and left hand side of the said plaza I would make 2 rows of quarters, and each row have 8 double quarters, which would take up 12 arm lengths in length and 30 in width, so that they should be on each side of the plaza, in which there would be 16 quarters, and total 32 altogether, in which I would quarter that cavalry left over from the auxiliary battalions, and if this should not be enough, I would assign them some of the quarters about the captain, and especially those which face the ditch. It remains for us now to quarter the extraordinary pikemen and veleti, which every battalion has, according to our arrangement, in addition to the 10 companies of infantry, 1,000 extraordinary pikemen and 500 veleti, so that the 2 regular battalions have 2,000 extraordinary pikemen and 1,000 extraordinary veleti, and the auxiliaries as many as they, so that one also comes to have to quarter 6,000 infantry, all of whom I would quarter on the west side along the ditches. From the point, therefore, of the front road and northward, leaving the space of 100 arm lengths from those quarters to the ditch, I would place a row of 5 double quarters, which would be 75 arm lengths long and 60 in width, so that with the width divided, each quarters would be allowed 15 arm lengths for length and 30 for width. And as there would be 10 quarters, I would quarter 300 infantry, assigning 30 infantry to each quarters. Leaving then a space of 31 arm lengths, I would place another row of 5 double quarters in a similar manner and with similar spaces, and then another, so that there would be 5 rows of 5 double quarters, which would come to be 50 quarters placed in a straight line on the north side, each distant 100 arm lengths from the ditches, and would quarter 1,500 infantry. Turning then on the left-hand side towards the west gate, I would want in all that tract between them and the said gate 5 other rows of double quarters, in a similar manner and with the same spaces. It is true that from one row to the other there would not be more than 15 arm lengths of space, in which there would also be quartered 1,500 infantry, and thus from the north gate to that of the west, following the ditches, in 100 quarters divided into 10 rows of 5 double quarters per row, the extraordinary pikemen and veleti of the regular battalions would be quartered. And so too from the west gate to that of the south, following the ditches in exactly the same manner, in another 10 rows of 10 quarters per row, the extraordinary pikemen and veleti of the auxiliary battalions would be quartered. Their heads, or rather their constables, could take those quarters on the side towards the ditches, which appeared most convenient for themselves. I would dispose the artillery all along the embankments of the ditches, and in all the other spaces remaining towards the west I would quarter all the unarmed men and all the baggage or impedimenta of the camp. And it has to be understood that this name of impedimenta the ancients intended all those carriages and wagons and all those things which are necessary to an army except the soldiers, as are carpenters, smiths, blacksmiths, shoemakers, engineers, and bombardiers, and others which should be placed among the number of the armed, herdsmen with their herds of castrated sheep and oxen, which are used for feeding the army, and in addition masters of every art or trade, together with public wagons for the public provisions of food and arms. And I would not particularly distinguish their quarters. I would only designate the roads that should not be occupied by them. Then the other spaces remaining between the roads, which would be 4, I would assign in general to all the impedimenta mentioned, that is, 1 to the herdsmen, another to artificers and workmen, another to the public wagons for provisions, and the 4th to the armourers. The roads which I would want left unoccupied would be the way of the plaza, the front road, and in addition a road that should be called the centre road, which should take off at the north and proceed towards the south and pass through the centre of the way of the plaza, which on the west side should have the same effect as the transverse road on the east side. And in addition to this a road that should go around the rear along the quarters of the extraordinary pikemen and veleti, and all these roads should be 30 arm lengths wide, and I would dispose the artillery along the ditches on the rear of the camp. Batista said, "I confess I do not understand, and I also do not believe that to say so makes me ashamed, as this is not my profession. None the less, I like this organization very much. I would want only that you should resolve these doubts for me. The one, why you make the roads and spaces around the quarters so wide. The other, which annoys me more, is this: how are these spaces that you designate for quarters to be used?" Fabrizio said, "You know that I made all the roads 30 arm lengths wide, so that a company of infantry is able to go through them in order or formation, which, if you remember well, I told you that each of these formations were 25 to 30 arm lengths wide. The space between the ditch and the quarters, which is 100 arm lengths wide, is necessary, since the companies and the artillery can be handled there, through which booty is taken, and, when space is needed into which to retire, new ditches and embankments are made. The quarters very distant from the ditches are better, for they are more distant from the fires and other things that might be able to draw the enemy to attack them. As to the second question, my intention is not that every space designated by me is covered by only one pavilion, but is to be used as an all-round convenience for those who are quartered, with several or few tents, so long as they do not go outside its limits. And in designing these quarters, the men must be most experienced and excellent architects, who, as soon as the captain has selected the site, know how to give it form, and divide it, and distinguish the roads, dividing the quarters with cords and hatches in such a practical manner that they might be divided and arranged quickly. And if confusion is not to arise, the camp must always face the same way, so that everyone will know on which road and in which space he has to find his quarters. And this ought to be observed at all times, in every place, and in a manner that it appears to be a movable city, which, wherever it goes, brings with it the same roads, the same houses, and the same appearance, which cannot be observed by those men who, seeking strong locations, have to change the form according to the variations in the sites. But the Romans made the places strong with ditches, ramparts, and embankments, for they placed a space around the camp, and in front of it they dug a ditch, and ordinarily 6 arm-lengths wide and 3 deep, which spaces they increased according to the length of time they resided in the one place, and according as they feared the enemy. For myself, I would not at present erect a stockade or rampart, unless I should want to winter in a place. I would, however, dig the ditch and embankment not less than that mentioned, but greater according to the necessity. With respect to the artillery, on every side of the encampment I would have a half-circle ditch, from which the artillery should be able to batter on flanks whoever should come to attack the moats or ditches. The soldiers ought also to be trained in this practice of knowing how to arrange an encampment, and work with them so that they may aid him in designing it, and the soldiers quick in knowing their places. And none of these is difficult, as will be told in its proper place. For now I want to pass on to the protection of the camp, which, without the distribution or assignment of guards, all the other efforts would be useless. Batista said, "Before you pass on to the guards, I would want you to tell me what methods are employed when others want to place the camp near the enemy, for I do not know whether there is time to be able to organize it without danger." Fabrizio said, "You have to know this, that no captain encamps near the enemy unless he is disposed to come to an engagement whenever the enemy wants. And, if the others are so disposed, there is no danger except the ordinary, since 2 parts of the army are organized to make an engagement, while the other part makes the encampment. In cases like this, the Romans assigned this method of fortifying the quarters to the triarii, while the principi and the astati remained under arms. They did this because the triarii, being the last to combat, were in time to leave the work if the enemy came, and take up their arms and take their places. If you want to imitate the Romans, you have to assign the making of the encampment to that company which you would want to put in the place of the triarii in the last part of the army. But let us return to the discussion of the guards. I do not seem to find, in connection with the ancients guarding the camp at night, that they had guards outside, distant from the ditches, as is the custom today, which they called the watch. I believe I should do this when I think how the army could be easily deceived, because of the difficulty which exists in checking or reviewing them, for they may be corrupted or attacked by the enemy, so that they judged it dangerous to trust them entirely or in part. And therefore all the power of their protection was within the ditches, which they dug with very great diligence and order, punishing capitally anyone who deviated from such an order. How this was arranged by them I will not talk to you further, in order not to tire you, since you are able to see it by yourselves, if you have not seen it up to now. I will say only briefly what would be done by me. I would regularly have 1/3 of the army remain armed every night, and 1/4 of them always on foot, who would be distributed throughout the embankments and all the places of the army, with double guards posted at each of its squares, where a part should remain and a part continually go from one side of the encampment to the other. And this arrangement I describe I would also observe by day if I had the enemy near. As to giving it a name, and renewing it every night, and doing the other things that are done in such guarding, since they are things already known, I will not talk further of them. I would only remind you of a most important matter, and by observing it do much good, by not observing it do much evil, which is that great diligence must be used as to who does not lodge within the camp at night, and who arrives there anew. And this is an easy matter to review who is quartered there with those arrangements we have designated, since every quarter having a predetermined number of men, it is an easy thing to see if there are any men missing, or if any are left over. And when they are missing without permission, to punish them as fugitives, and if they are left over, to learn who they are, what they know, and what their conditions. Such diligence results in the enemy not being able to have correspondence with your heads, and not to have co-knowledge of your counsels. If this had not been observed with diligence by the Romans, Claudius Nero could not, when he had Hannibal near to him, have departed from the encampment he had in Lucania, and go and return from the marches, without Hannibal being aware of it. But it is not enough to make these good arrangements, unless they are made to be observed by great security, for there is nothing that wants so much observance as any required in the army. Therefore the laws for their enforcement should be harsh and hard, and the executor very hard. The Romans punished with capital penalty whoever was missing from the guard, whoever abandoned the place given him in combat, whoever brought anything concealed from outside the encampment. If anyone should tell of having performed some great act in battle, and should not have done it, if anyone should have fought except at the command of the captain, if anyone from fear had thrown aside his arms, and if it occurred that an entire cohort or an entire legion had made a similar error, in order that they not all be put to death, they put their names in a purse, and drew the 10th part, and those they put to death. Which penalty was so carried out that if everyone did not hear of it, they at least feared it. And because where there are severe punishments, there also ought to be rewards, so that men should fear and hope at the same time, they proposed rewards for every great deed, such as to him who during the fighting saved the life of one of its citizens, to whoever first climbed the walls of enemy towns, to whoever first entered the encampment of the enemy, to whoever in battle wounded or killed an enemy, to whoever had thrown him from his horse. And thus any act of virtue was recognized and rewarded by the consuls, and publicly praised by everyone. And those who received gifts for any of these things, in addition to the glory and fame they acquired among the soldiers, when they returned to their country, exhibited them with solemn pomp and with great demonstrations among their friends and relatives. It is not to marvel, therefore, if that people acquired so much empire, when they had so great an observance of punishment and reward toward them, which operated either for their good or evil, should merit either praise or censure. It behooves us to observe the greater part of these things. And it does not appear proper for me to be silent on a method of punishment observed by them, which was, that as the miscreant was convicted before the tribune or the consul, he was struck lightly by him with a rod, after which striking of the criminal he was allowed to flee, and all the soldiers allowed to kill him, so that immediately each of them threw stones or darts, or hit him with other arms, of a kind from which he went little alive, and rarely returned to camp. And to such that did return to camp, he was not allowed to return home, except with so much inconvenience and ignominy, that it was much better for him to die. You see this method almost observed by the Swiss, who have the condemned publicly put to death by the other soldiers, which is well considered and done for the best. For if it is desired that one be not a defender of the criminal, the better remedy that is found is to make him the punisher of him the criminal. For in some respects he favours him, while from other desires he longs for his punishment, if he himself is the executioner, than if the execution is carried out by another. If you want, therefore, that one is not to be favoured in his mistakes by a people, a good remedy is to see to it that the public judge him. In support of this, the example of Manlius Capital can be cited, who, when he was accused by the Senate, was defended so much by the public, up to the point where it no longer became the judge, but having become arbiter of his cause, condemned him to death. It is, therefore, a method of punishing this, of doing away with tumults, and of having justice observed. And since, in restraining armed men, the fears of laws and of men is not enough, the ancients added the authority of God. And therefore, with very great ceremony, they made their soldiers swear to observe the military discipline, so that if they did the contrary, they not only had to fear the laws and men, but God. And they used every industry to fill them with religion. End of Book 6, Part 1. Book 6, Part 2 of The Art of War. Batista said, "Did the Romans permit women to be in their armies, or that they indulge in indolent games that are used today?" Fabrizio said, "They prohibited both of them, and this prohibition was not very difficult, because the exercises which they gave each day to the soldiers were so many, sometimes being occupied all together, sometimes individually, that no time was left for them to think either of venery or of games, or of other things which make soldiers seditious and useless." Batista said, "I like that. But tell me, when the army had to take off, what arrangements did they have?" Fabrizio said, "The captain's trumpet was sounded 3 times. At the first sound the tents were taken down and piled into heaps. At the second they loaded the burdens, and at the third they moved in the manner mentioned above, with the impedimenta behind, the armed men on every side, placing the legions in the centre. And therefore you would have to have a battalion of auxiliaries move, and behind it its particular impedimenta, and with those the 4th part of the public impedimenta, which would be all those who should be quartered in one of those sections of the camp which we showed a short while back. And therefore it would be well to have each one of them assigned to a battalion, so that when the army moved everyone should know where his place was in marching. And every battalion ought to proceed on its way in this fashion, with its own impedimenta, and with a quarter of the public impedimenta at its rear, as we showed the Roman army marched." Batista said, "In placing the encampment, did they have any other considerations than those you mentioned?" Fabrizio said, "I tell you again that in their encampments the Romans wanted to be able to employ the usual form of their method, and in the observance of which they took no other consideration. But as to other considerations, they had 2 principal ones: the one, to locate themselves in a healthy place, and to locate themselves where the enemy should be unable to besiege them and cut off their supply of water and provisions. To avoid this weakness, therefore, they avoided marshy places or exposure to noxious winds. They recognized these not so much from the characteristics of the site, but from the looks of the inhabitants. And if they saw them with poor colour, or short-winded, or full of other infections, they did not encamp there. As to the other part, of not being besieged, the nature of the place must be considered, where the friends are and where the enemy, and from these make a conjecture whether or not you could be besieged. And therefore the captain must be very expert concerning sites of the countries, and have around him many others who have the same expertness. They also avoided sickness and hunger so as not to disorganize the army. For if you want to keep it healthy, you must see to it that the soldiers sleep under tents, that they are quartered where there are trees to create shade, where there is wood to cook food, and not to march in the heat. You need, therefore, to consider the encampment the day before you arrive there, and in winter guard against marching in the snow and through ice without the convenience of making a fire, and not lack necessary clothing, and not to drink bad water. Those who get sick in the house, have them taken care of by doctors, for a captain has no remedy when he has to fight both sickness and the enemy. But nothing is more useful in maintaining an army healthy than exercise, and therefore the ancients made them exercise every day. Whence it is seen how much exercise is of value, for in the quarters it keeps you healthy, and in battle it makes you victorious. As to hunger, not only is it necessary to see that the enemy does not impede your provisions, but to provide whence you are to obtain them, and to see that those you have are not lost. And therefore you must always have provisions on hand for the army for a month. and beyond that to tax the neighbouring friends that they provide you daily, keep the provisions in a strong place, and above all dispense it with diligence, giving each one a reasonable measure each day, and so observe this part that they do not become disorganized. For every other thing in war can be overcome with time, this only with time overcomes you. Never make anyone your enemy who, while seeking to overcome you with the sword, can overcome you by hunger, because if such a victory is not honourable, it is more secure and more certain. That army, therefore, cannot escape hunger which does not observe justice, and licentiously consume whatever it please. For one evil causes the provisions not to arrive, and the other that when they arrive they are uselessly consumed. Therefore the ancients arranged that what was given was eaten, and in time they assigned so that no soldier ate except when the captain did. Which, as to being observed by the modern armies, every one does the contrary, and deservedly they cannot be called orderly and sober as the ancients, but licentious and drunkards. Batista said, "You have said in the beginning of arranging the encampment that you did not want to stay only with 2 battalions, but took up 4, to show how a fair-sized army was quartered. Therefore I would want you to tell me 2 things. The one, if I have more or less men, how should I quarter them? The other, what number of soldiers will be enough to fight against any enemy?" Fabrizio said, "To the first question I reply that if the army has 4,000 or 6,000 soldiers, more or less, rows of quarters are taken away or added as are needed, and in this way it is possible to accommodate more or fewer infinitely. None the less, when the Romans joined together 2 consular armies, they made 2 encampments, and had the parts of the disarmed men face each other. As to the second question, I reply that the regular Roman army had about 24,000 soldiers, but when a great force pressed them, the most they assembled were 50,000. With this number they opposed 200,000 Gauls, whom they assaulted after the first war which they had with the Carthaginians. With the same number they opposed Hannibal. And you have to note that the Romans and Greeks had made war with few soldiers, strengthened by order and by art. The Westerners and Easterners have made it with a multitude. But one of these nations serves itself of natural fury, as are the Westerners, the other of the great obedience which its men show to their king. But in Greece and Italy, as there is not this natural fury, nor the natural reverence towards the king, it has been necessary to turn to discipline, which is so powerful that it made the few able to overcome the fury and natural obstinacy of the many. I tell you, therefore, if you want to imitate the Romans and Greeks, the number of 50,000 soldiers ought not to be exceeded. Rather, they should actually be less, for the many cause confusion, and do not allow discipline to be observed, nor the orders learned. And Pyrrhus used to say that with 15,000 men he would assail the world. But let us pass on to another part. We have made our army win an engagement, and I showed the troubles that can occur in battle. We have made it march, and I have narrated with what impedimenta it can be surrounded while marching. And lastly, we have quartered it, where not only a little repose from past hardship ought to be taken, but also to think about how the war ought to be concluded. For in the quarters many things are discussed, especially if there remain enemies in the field, towns under suspicion, of which it is well to reassure oneself and to capture those which are hostile. It is necessary, therefore, to come to these demonstrations and to pass over this difficulty with that same glory with which we have fought up to the present. Coming down to particulars, therefore, that if it should happen to you that many men or many peoples should do something which might be useful to you and very harmful to them, as would be the destruction of the walls of their city, or the sending of many of themselves into exile, it is necessary that you either deceive them in a way that every one should believe he is affected, so that one not helping the other, all find themselves oppressed without a remedy, or rather to command every one what they ought to do on the same day, so that each one, believing himself to be alone to whom the command is given, thinks of obeying it, and not of remedy, and thus without tumult your command is executed by every one, If you should have suspicion of the loyalty of any people, and should want to assure yourself and occupy them without notice, in order to disguise your design more easily, you cannot do better than to communicate to him some of your design, requesting his aid, and indicate to him that you want to undertake another enterprise, and to have a mind alien to every thought of his, which will cause him not to think of his defence, as he does not believe you are thinking of attacking him, and he will give you the opportunity which will enable you to satisfy your desire easily. If you should have present in your army someone who keeps the enemy advised of your designs, you cannot do better, if you want to avail yourself of his evil intentions, than to communicate to him those things you do not want to do, and to keep silent those things you want to do, and tell him you are apprehensive of the things of which you are not apprehensive, and conceal those things of which you are apprehensive, which will cause the enemy to undertake some enterprise in the belief he knows your designs, in which you can deceive him and defeat him. If you should design, as did Claudius Nero, to decrease your army, sending aid to some friend, and they should not be aware of it, it is necessary that the encampment be not decreased, but to maintain entire all the signs and arrangements, making the same fires and posting the same guards as for the entire army. Likewise, if you should attach a new force to your army, and do not want the enemy to know you have enlarged it, it is necessary that the encampment be not increased, for it is always most useful to keep your designs secret. When Metellus, when he was with the armies in Spain, to one who asked him what he was going to do the next day, answered, that if his shirt knew it, he would burn it. Marcus Crassus, to one who asked him when he was going to move his army, said, "Do you believe you are alone in not hearing the trumpets?" If you should desire to learn the secrets of your enemy, and know his arrangements, some used to send ambassadors, and with them men expert in war disguised in the clothing of the family, who, taking the opportunity to observe the enemy army, and consideration of his strengths and weaknesses, have given them the occasion to defeat him. Some have sent a close friend of theirs into exile, and through him have learned the designs of their adversary. You may also learn similar secrets from the enemy if you should take prisoners for this purpose. Marius, in the war he waged against Simbari, in order to learn the loyalty of those Gauls who lived in Lombardy and were leagued with the Roman people, sent them letters, open and sealed, and in the open ones he wrote them that they should not open the sealed ones except at such a time. And before that time he called for them to be returned, and finding them opened, he knew their loyalty was not complete. Some captains, when they were assaulted, have not wanted to go to meet the enemy, but have gone to assail his country and constrain him to return and defend his home. This often has turned out well, because your soldiers begin to win and fill themselves with booty and confidence, while those of the enemy become dismayed, it appearing to them that from being winners they have become losers. So that to whoever has made this diversion it has turned out well. But this can only be done by that man who has his country stronger than that of the enemy, for if it were otherwise he would go on to lose. It has often been a useful thing for a captain who finds himself besieged in the quarters of the enemy to set in motion proceedings for an accord, and to make a truce with him for several days, which only an enemy negligent in every way will do, so that availing yourself of his negligence, you can easily obtain the opportunity to get out of his hands. Sulla twice freed himself from his enemies in this manner, and with this same deceit Hannibal in Spain got away from the forces of Claudius Nero, who had besieged him. It also helps one in freeing himself from the enemy to do something in addition to those mentioned, which keeps him at bay. This is done in two ways, either by assaulting him with part of your forces, so that, intent on the battle, he gives the rest of your forces the opportunity to be able to save themselves, or to have some new incident spring up, which by the novelty of the thing makes him wonder, and for this reason to become apprehensive and stand still, as you know Hannibal did, who, being trapped by Fabius Maximus, at night placed some torches between the horns of many oxen, so that Fabius, in suspense over this novelty, did not think further of impeding his passage. A captain ought, among all the other actions of his, endeavour with every art to divide the forces of the enemy, either by making him suspicious of his men in whom he trusted, or by giving him cause that he has to separate his forces, and because of this become weaker. The first method is accomplished by watching the things of some of those whom he has next to him, as exists in war, to save his possessions, maintaining his children or other of his necessities without charge. You know how Hannibal, having burned all the fields around Rome, caused only those of Fabius Maximus to remain safe. You know how Coriolanus, when he came with the army to Rome, saved the possessions of the nobles and burned and sacked those of the plebs. When Metellus led the army against Jugurtha, all the ambassadors sent to him by Jugurtha were requested by him to give up Jugurtha as a prisoner. Afterwards, writing letters to these same people on the same subject, wrote in such a way that in a little while Jugurtha became suspicious of all of his counsellors, and in different ways dismissed them. Hannibal, having taken refuge with Antiochus, the Roman ambassadors frequented him so much at home that Antiochus became suspicious of him, did not afterwards have any faith in his counsels. As to dividing the enemy forces, there is no more certain way than to have one country assaulted by part of your forces, so that being constrained to go and defend it, they of that country abandon the war. This is the method employed by Fabius when his army had encountered the forces of the Gauls, the Tuscans, Umbrians, and Samnites. Titus Didius, having a small force in comparison with those of the enemy, and awaiting a legion from Rome, the enemy wanted to go out to meet it, so that, in order that it should not do so, he gave out by voice throughout his army that he wanted to undertake an engagement with the enemy on the next day. Then he took steps that some of the prisoners he had were given the opportunity to escape, who carried back the order of the consul to fight on the next day, and caused the enemy, in order not to diminish his forces, not to go out to meet the legion, and in this way he kept himself safe. Which method did not serve to divide the forces of the enemy, but to double his own. Some, in order to divide the enemy forces, have employed allowing him to enter their country, and, in proof, allowed him to take many towns, so that by placing guards in them he diminished his forces, and in this manner, having made him weak, assaulted and defeated him. Some others, when they wanted to go into one province, feigned making an assault on another, and used so much industry that as soon as they extended toward that one where there was no fear they would enter, have overcome it before the enemy had time to succour it. For the enemy, as he is not certain whether you are to return back to the place first threatened by you, is constrained not to abandon the one place and succour the other, and thus often he does not defend either. In addition to the matters mentioned, it is important to a captain, when sedition or discord arises among the soldiers, to know how to extinguish it with art. The better way is to castigate the heads of this folly, but to do it in a way that you are able to punish them before they are able to become aware of it. The method is, if they are far from you, not to call only the guilty ones, but all the others together with them, so that as they do not believe there is any cause to punish them, they are not disobedient, but provide the opportunity for punishment. When they are present, one ought to strengthen himself with the guiltless, and by their aid punish them. If there should be discord among them, the best way is to expose them to danger, which fear will always make them united. But above all, what keeps the army united is the reputation of its captain, which only results from his virtue, for neither blood or birth or authority attain it without virtue. And the first thing a captain is expected to do is to see to it that the soldiers are paid and punished. For any time payment is missed, punishment must also be dispensed with, because you cannot castigate a soldier you rob unless you pay him. And as he wants to live, he can abstain from being robbed. But if you pay him but do not punish him, he becomes insolent in every way, because you become of little esteem, and to whomever it happens, he cannot maintain the dignity of his position. And if he does not maintain it, Of necessity, tumults and discords follow, which are the ruin of an army. The ancient captains had a molestation from which the present ones are almost free, which was the interpretation of sinister omens to their undertakings. For if an arrow fell in the army, if the sun or the moon was obscured, if an earthquake occurred, if the captain fell while either mounting or dismounting from his horse, it was interpreted in a sinister fashion by the soldiers, and instilled so much fear in them that when they came to an engagement they were easily defeated. And therefore, as soon as such an incident occurred, the ancient captains either demonstrated the cause of it, or reduced it to its natural causes, or interpreted it to favour their own purposes. When Caesar went to Africa, and having fallen while he was putting out to sea, said, "Africa, I have taken you." And many have profited from an eclipse of the moon and from earthquakes. These things cannot happen in our time, as much because our men are not as superstitious as because our religion by itself entirely takes away such ideas. Yet if it should occur, the orders of the ancients should be imitated. When, either from hunger or other natural necessity or human passion, your enemy is brought to extreme desperation, and driven by it comes to fight with you, you ought to remain within your quarters and avoid battle as much as you can. Thus the Lacedaemonians did against the Messenians. Thus Caesar did against Africanus and Petreius. When Fulvius was consul against the Cimbri, he had the cavalry assault the enemy continually for many days, and considered how they would issue forth from their quarters in order to pursue them, whence he placed an ambush behind the quarters of the Cimbri, and had them assaulted by the cavalry, and when the Cimbri came out of their quarters to pursue them, Fulvius seized them and plundered them. It has been very effective for a captain, when his army is in the vicinity of the enemy army, to send his forces with the insignia of the enemy to rob and burn his own country, whence the enemy, believing they were forces coming to their aid, also ran out to help them plunder, and because of this have become disorganized, and given the adversary the faculty of overcoming them. Alexander of Epirus used these means fighting against the Illyriki, and Leptinus the Syracusan against the Carthaginians, and the design succeeded happily for both. Many have overcome the enemy by giving him the faculty of eating and drinking beyond his means, feigning being afraid, and leaving his quarters full of wine and herds, and when the enemy had filled himself beyond every natural limit, they assaulted him and overcame him with injury to him. Thus Tamirus did against Cyrus, and Tiberius Gracchus against the Spaniards. Some have poisoned the wine and other things to eat in order to be able to overcome them more easily. A little while ago I said I did not find the ancients had kept a night watch outside, and I thought they did it to avoid the evils that could happen, for it has been found that sometimes the sentries posted in the daytime to keep watch for the enemy have been the ruin of him who posted them. For it has happened often that when they have been taken, and by force have been made to give the signal by which they called their own men, who, coming at the signal, have been either killed or taken. Sometimes it helps to deceive the enemy by changing one of your habits, relying on which he is ruined, as a captain had already done, who, when he wanted to have a signal made by his men indicating the coming of an enemy, at night with fire and in the daytime with smoke, commanded that both smoke and flame be made without any intermission, so that when the enemy came, he should remain in the belief that he came without being seen, as he had not seen the signals usually made to indicate his discovery, made, because of his going disorganized, the victory of his adversary easier. Menno Rhodius, when he wanted to draw the enemy from the strong places, sent one in the disguise of a fugitive, who affirmed that his army was full of discord, and that the greater part were deserting, and to give proof of this matter, had certain tumults started among the quarters, whence the enemy, thinking he was able to break him, assaulted him and was routed. In addition to the things mentioned, one ought to take care not to bring the enemy to extreme desperation, which Caesar did when he fought the Germans, who, having blocked the way to them, seeing that they were unable to flee, and necessity having made them brave, desired rather to undergo the hardship of pursuing them if they defended themselves. Lucilius, when he saw that some Macedonian cavalry who were with him had gone over to the side of the enemy, quickly sounded the call to battle and commanded the other forces to pursue it. Whence the enemy, believing that Lucullus did not want to start the battle, went to attack the Macedonians with such fury that they were constrained to defend themselves, and thus, against their will, they became fighters of the fugitives. Knowing how to make yourself secure of a town when you have doubts of its loyalty once you have conquered it, or before, is also important, which some examples of the ancients teach you. Pompey, when he had doubts of the Catanians, begged them to accept some infirm people he had in his army, and, having sent some very robust men in the disguise of infirm ones, occupied the town. Publius Valerius, fearful of the loyalty of the Epidaurians, announced an amnesty to be held, as we will tell you, at a church outside the town, and when all the public had gone there for the amnesty, he locked the doors, and then let no one out from inside except those whom he trusted. Alexander the Great, when he wanted to go into Asia and secure Thrace for himself, took with him all the chiefs of this province, giving them provisions, and placed low-born men in charge of the common people of Thrace. And thus he kept the chiefs content by paying them, and the common people quiet by not having heads who should disquiet them. But among all the things by which captains gain the people over to themselves are the examples of chastity and justice, as was that of Scipio in Spain, when he returned that girl, beautiful in body, to her husband and father, which did more than arms in gaining over Spain. Caesar, when he paid for the lumber that he used to make the stockades around his army in Gaul, gained such a name for himself of being just, that he facilitated the acquisition of that province for himself. I do not know what else remains for me to talk about regarding such events, and there does not remain any part of the matter that has not been discussed by us. The only thing lacking is to tell of the methods of capturing and defending towns, which I am about to do willingly, if it is not painful for you now. Batista said, "Your humaneness is so great that it makes us pursue our desires without being afraid of being held presumptuous, since you have offered it willingly, that we would be ashamed to ask you. Therefore we say only this of you, that you cannot do a greater or more thankful benefit to us than to furnish us this discussion. But before you pass on to that other matter, resolve a doubt for us, whether it is better to continue the war even in winter, as is done to-day, or wage it only in summer, and go into quarters in the winter, as the ancients did." Fabrizio said, "Here, if there had not been the prudence of the questioner, some part that merits consideration would have been omitted. I tell you again that the ancients did everything better and with more prudence than we, and if some error is made in other things, all are made in matters of war. There is nothing more imprudent or more perilous to a captain than to wage war in winter, and more dangerous to him who brings it than to him who awaits it. The reason is this: all the industry used in military discipline is used in order to be organized to undertake an engagement with your enemy, as this is the end towards which a captain must aim, for the engagement makes you win or lose a war. Therefore, whoever knows how to organize it better, who has his army better disciplined, has the greater advantage in this, and can hope more to win it. On the other hand, there is nothing more inimical to organization than the rough sights or cold and wet seasons. For the rough sight does not allow you to use the plenitude of your forces according to discipline, and the cold and wet seasons do not allow you to keep your forces together, and you cannot have them face the enemy united, but, of necessity, you must quarter them separately and without order, having to take into account the castles, hamlets, and farmhouses that receive you, so that all the hard work employed by you in disciplining your army is in vain. And do not marvel if they war in winter time to-day, for as the armies are without discipline, and do not know the harm that is done to them by not being quartered together, for their annoyance does not enable those arrangements to be made and to observe that discipline which they do not have. Yet the injury caused by campaigning in the field in the winter ought to be observed, remembering that the French in the year 1503 were routed on the Garigliano by the winter, and not by the Spaniards. For, as I have told you, whoever assaults has even greater disadvantage, because weather harms him more when he is in the territory of others and wants to make war. Whence he is compelled either to withstand the inconvenience of water and cold in order to keep together, or to divide his forces to escape them. But whoever waits can select a place to his liking, and await him, the enemy, with fresh forces, and can unite them in a moment, and go out to find the enemy forces who cannot withstand their fury. Thus were the French routed, and thus are those always routed who assault an enemy in winter time, who in itself has prudence. Whoever, therefore, does not want the forces, organization, discipline, and virtue in some part to be of value, makes war in the field in the winter time. And because the Romans wanted to avail themselves of all these things into which they put so much industry, avoided not only the winter time, but rough mountains and difficult places, and anything else which could impede their ability to demonstrate their skill and virtue. So this suffices to answer your question. And now let us come to treat of the attacking and defending of towns, and of sites, and of their edifices. End of Book 6, Part 2. Book 7, Part 1 of the Art of War. You ought to know that towns and fortresses can be strong either by nature or industry. Those are strong by nature which are surrounded by rivers or marshes, as is Mantua or Ferrara, or those situated on a rock or sloping mountain, as Monaco and San Leo. For those situated on mountains which are not difficult to climb, today are, with respect to caves and artillery, very weak. And therefore, very often today, a plain is sought on which to build a city, to make it strong by industry. The first industry is to make the walls twisted and full of turned recesses, which pattern results in the enemy not being able to approach them, as they will be able to be attacked easily not only from the front, but on the flanks. If the walls are made too high, they are excessively exposed to the blows of the artillery. If they are made too low, they are very easily scaled. If you dig ditches or moats in front of them to make it difficult to employ ladders, if it should happen that the enemy fills them, which a large army can do easily, the wall becomes prey to the enemy. I believe, therefore, subject to a better judgment, that if you want to make provision against both evils, the wall ought to be made high, with the ditches inside and not outside. This is the strongest way to build that is possible, for it protects you from artillery and ladders, and does not give the enemy the faculty of filling the ditches. The wall, therefore, ought to be as high as occurs to you, and not less than 3 arm-lengths wide, to make it difficult to be ruined. It ought to have towers placed at intervals of 200 arm-lengths. The ditch inside ought to be at least 30 arm-lengths wide and 12 deep, and all the earth that is excavated in making the ditch is thrown towards the city, and is sustained by a wall that is part of the base of the ditch, and extends again as much above the ground as that a man may take cover behind it, which has the effect of making the depth of the ditch greater. In the ditch, every 200 arm-lengths, there should be a matted enclosure, which, with the artillery, causes injury to anyone who should descend into it. The heavy artillery which defends the city are placed behind the wall enclosing the ditch, for to defend the wall from the front, as it is high, it is not possible to use conveniently anything other than the small or middle-sized guns. If the enemy comes to scale your wall, the height of the first wall easily protects you. If he comes with artillery, he must first batter down the first wall. But once it is battered down, because the nature of all batterings is to cause the wall to fall towards the battered side, the ruin of the wall will result, since it does not find a ditch which to receive and hide it, in doubling the depth of the ditch, so that it is not possible for you to pass on further, as you will find a ruin that holds you back and a ditch which will impede you, and from the wall of the ditch, in safety, the enemy artillery kills you. The only remedy there exists for you is to fill up the ditch, which is very difficult, as much because its capacity is large, as from the difficulty you have in approaching it, since the walls being winding and recessed, you can enter among them only with difficulty, for the reasons previously mentioned. And then having to climb over the ruin with the material in hand causes you very great difficulty, so that I know a city so organized is completely indestructible." Batista said, "If, in addition to the ditch inside, there should also be one on the outside, wouldn't the encampment be stronger?" Fabrizio said, "It would be without doubt, but my reasoning is that if you want to dig one ditch only, it is better inside than outside." Batista said, "Would you have water in the ditch, or would you leave them dry?" Fabrizio said, "Opinions are different, for ditches full of water protect you from subterranean tunnels. The ditches without water make it more difficult for you to fill them in again. But considering everything, I would have them without water, for they are more secure, and as it has been observed that in winter time the ditches ice over, the capture of a city is made easy, as happened at Mirandola when Pope Julius besieged it. And to protect yourself from tunnels, I would dig them so deep that whoever should want to tunnel deeper should find water. I would also build the fortresses in a way similar to the walls and ditches, so that similar difficulty would be encountered in destroying it. I want to call to mind one good thing to anyone who defends a city, and this is that they do not erect bastions outside, and they be distant from its wall. And another to anyone who builds the fortress, and this is that he not build any redoubts in them, into which whoever is inside can retire when the wall is lost. What makes me give the first counsel is that no one ought to do anything through the medium of which you begin to lose your reputation without any remedy, the loss of which makes others esteem you less, and dismay those who undertake your defence. And what I say will always happen to you if you erect bastions outside the town that you have to defend, for you will always lose them, as you are unable to defend small things when they are placed under the fury of the artillery, so that in losing them they become the beginning and the cause of your ruin. Genoa, when it rebelled from King Louis of France, erected some bastions on the hills outside the city, which, as soon as they were lost, and they were lost quickly, also caused the city to be lost. As to the second counsel, I affirm there is nothing more dangerous concerning a fortress than to be able to retire into it, for the hope that men have when they abandon a place cause it to be lost, and when it is lost, it then causes the entire fortress to be lost. For an example, there is the recent loss of the fortress of Forli, when the Countess Catherine defended it against Cesare Borgia, son of Pope Alexander VI, who had led the army of the King of France. That entire fortress was full of places by both of them, for it was originally a citadel. There was a moat before coming to the fortress, so that it was entered by means of a drawbridge. The fortress was divided into 3 parts, and each part separated by a ditch, and with water between them, and one passed from one place to another by means of bridges, whence the Duke battered one of those parts of the fortress with artillery, and opened up part of a wall, whence Monsignor Giovanni de Carsali, who was in charge of the garrison, did not think of defending that opening, but abandoned to retire into the other places, so that the force of the Duke, having entered that part without opposition, immediately seized all of it, for they became masters of the bridges that connected the parts with each other. He lost the fort, which was held to be indestructible, because of 2 mistakes. One, because it had so many redoubts. The other, because no one was made master of his bridges. They were unprotected. The poorly built fortress and the little prudence of the defender, therefore, brought disgrace to the magnanimous enterprise of the Countess, who had the courage to face an army which neither the King of Naples nor the Duke of Milan had faced. And although the Duke's efforts did not have a good ending, none the less he became noted for those honours which his virtue merited, which was testified to by the many epigrams made in those times praising him. If I should therefore have to build a fortress, I would make its walls strong, and ditches in the manner we have discussed. Nor would I build anything else to live in but houses, and they be weak and low, so that they would not impede the sight of the walls to anyone who might be in the plaza, so that the captain should be able to see with his own eyes where he could be of help, and that everyone should understand that if the walls and the ditch were lost, the entire fortress would be lost. And even if I should build some redoubts, I would have the bridges so separated that each part should protect the bridge in its own area, arranging that it be buttressed on its pilasters in the middle of the ditch. Baptista said, "You have said that today the little things cannot be defended, and it seems to me I have understood the opposite, that the smaller the thing was, the better it was defended." Fabrizio said, "You have not understood well, for today that place cannot be called strong where he who defends it does not have room to retire among new ditches and ramparts. For such is the fury of the artillery, that he who relies on protection of only one wall or rampart deceives himself. And as the bastions, if you want them not to exceed their regular measurements, for then they would be terraces and castles, are not made so that others can retire into them, they are lost quickly. And therefore it is wise practice to leave these bastions outside, and fortify the entrances of the terraces, and cover the gates with revettes, so that one does not go in or out of the gate in a straight line, and there is a ditch with a bridge over it from the revette to the gate. The gates also are fortified with shutters, so as to allow your men to re-enter when, after going out to fight, it happens that the enemy drives them back, and in the ensuing mixing of men the enemy does not enter with them. And therefore these things have also been found which the ancients called cataracts, which being let down keep out the enemy, but save one's friends. For in such cases one cannot avail himself of anything else, neither bridges or the gate, since both are occupied by the crowd." Baptista said, "I have seen these shutters that you mention, made of small beams, in Germany in the form of iron grids, while those of ours are made entirely of massive planks. I would want to know whence this difference arises, and which is stronger." Fabrizio said, "I will tell you again that the methods and organizations of war in all the world, with respect to those of the ancients, are extinct. But in Italy they are entirely lost, and if there is something more powerful, it results from the examples of the Ultramontane. You may have heard, and these others can remember, how weakly things were built before King Charles of France crossed into Italy in the year 1494. The battlements were made a half arm length wide. The places for the crossbowmen and bombardiers were made with a small aperture outside and a large one inside, and with many other defects, which I will omit not to be tedious. For the defences are easily taken away from slender battlements. The places for bombardiers built that way are easily opened and demolished. Now from the French we have learned to make the battlements wide and large, and also to make the places of bombardiers wide on the inside, and narrow at the centre of the wall, and then again widen it up on the outside edge. And this results in the artillery being able to demolish its defences only with difficulty. The French, moreover, have many other arrangements such as these, which, because they have not been seen thus, have not been given consideration. Among which is the method of the shutters made in the form of a grid, which is by far a better method than yours. For if you have to prepare the shutters of agates such as yours, lowering it if you are locked inside, and hence unable to injure the enemy, so that they can attack it safely either in the dark or with a fire. But if it is made in the shape of a grid, you can, once it is lowered, by those weaves and intervals to be able to defend it with lances, crossbows, and every other kind of arms." Baptista said, "I have also seen other Ultramontane custom in Italy, and it is this: making the carriages of the artillery with the spokes of the wheels bent towards the axles. I would like to know why they make them this way, and it seems to me it would be stronger straight, as those of our wheels." Fabrizio said, "Never believe that things which differ from the ordinary are made at home. But if you would believe that I should make them such as to be more beautiful, you would err. For where strength is necessary, no account is taken of beauty, but they all arise from being safer and stronger than ours. The reason is this: when the carriage is loaded, it either goes on a level or inclines to the right or left side. When it goes level, the wheels equally sustain the weight, which, being divided equally between them, does not burden them much. When it inclines, it comes to have all the weight of the load upon that wheel on which it inclines. If its spokes are straight, they can easily collapse, since the wheel being inclined, the spokes also come to incline, and do not sustain the weight in a straight line. And thus, when the carriage rides level, and when they carry less weight, they come to be stronger. When the carriage rides inclined, and when they carry more weight, they are weaker. The contrary happens to the bent spokes of the French carriages, for when the carriage inclines to one side, it leans straight on them, since being ordinarily bent, they come to be more straight or vertical, and can sustain all the weight strongly. And when the carriage goes level, and the spokes are bent, they sustain half the weight. But let us return to our cities and fortresses. The French, for the greater security of their towns, and to enable them during sieges to put into and withdraw forces from them more easily, also employ, in addition to the things mentioned, another arrangement, of which I have not yet seen any example in Italy. And it is this, that they erect 2 pilasters at the outside point of a drawbridge, and upon each of them they balance a beam, so that half of it comes over the bridge and the other half outside. And they join small beams to the part outside, which are woven together to form one beam to another in the shape of a grid. And on the inside they attach a chain to the end of each beam. When they want to close the bridge from the outside, therefore, they release the chains and allow all that gridded part to drop, which closes the bridge when it is lowered. And when they want to open it, they pull on the chains, and the gridded beams come to be raised. And they can be raised so that a man can pass under, but not a horse, and also so much that a horse with a man can pass under, and also can be closed entirely, for it is lowered and raised like a lace curtain. This arrangement is more secure than the shutters, for it can be impeded by the enemy so that it cannot come down only with difficulty, and it does not come down in a straight line like the shutters, which can be easily penetrated. Those who want to build a city, therefore, ought to have all the things mentioned installed. And in addition, they should want at least 1 mile around the wall, where either farming or building would not be allowed, but should be open field, where no bushes, embankments, trees, or houses should exist which would impede the vision, and which should be in the rear of a besieging enemy. It is to be noted that a town which has its ditches outside with its embankments higher than the ground is very weak, for they provide a refuge for the enemy who assaults you, and does not impede him in attacking you, because they can easily be forced and opened, giving his artillery an emplacement. But let us pass into the town. I do not want to waste much time in showing you that, in addition to the things mentioned previously, provisions for living and fighting supplies must also be included, for they are the things which everyone needs, and without them every other provision is in vain. And generally 2 things ought to be done: provision yourself, and deprive the enemy of the opportunity to avail himself of the resources of your country. Therefore, any straw, grain, and cattle which you cannot receive into your house ought to be destroyed. Whoever defends a town ought to see to it that nothing is done in a tumultuous and disorganized manner, and have means to let everyone know what he has to do in any incident. The manner is this, that the women, children, aged, and the public stay at home, and leave the town free to the young and the brave, who, armed, are distributed for defence, part being on the walls, part at the gates, part in the principal places of the city, in order to remedy those evils which might arise within. Another part is not assigned to any place, but is prepared to help anyone requesting their help. And when matters are so organized, only with difficulty can tumults arise which disturb you. I want you to note also that in attacking and defending cities, nothing gives the enemy hope of being able to occupy a town than to know the inhabitants are not in the habit of looking for the enemy. For often cities are lost entirely from fear, without any other action. When one assaults such a city, he should make all his appearances ostentatious and terrible. On the other hand, he who is assaulted ought to place brave men, who are not afraid of thoughts, but by arms, on the sides where the enemy comes to fight. For if the attempt proves vain, courage grows in the besieged, and then the enemy is forced to overcome those inside with his virtue and his reputation. The equipment with which the ancients defended the towns are many, such as ballistas, onagers, scorpions, arqueballistas, large bows and slingshots. And those with which they assaulted were also many, such as battering rams, wagons, hollow metal fuses, musculi, trench covers, plutei, siege machines, vinae, scythes, and turtles, somewhat similar to present-day tanks. In place of these things, today there is the artillery, which serves both attackers and defenders, and hence I will not speak further about it. But let us return to our discussion, and come to the details of the siege attack. One ought to take care not to be able to be taken by hunger, and not to be forced to capitulate by assaults. As to hunger, it has been said that it is necessary, before the siege arrives, to be well provided with food. But when it is lacking during a long siege, some extraordinary means of being provided by friends who want to save you have been observed to be employed, especially if a river runs in the middle of the besieged city, as were the Romans when their castle of Casalino was besieged by Hannibal, who, not being able to send them anything by way of the river, threw great quantities of nuts into it, which, being carried by the river without being able to be impeded, fed the Casalinese for some time. Some, when they were besieged, in order to show the enemy they had grain left over, and to make them despair of being able to defeat them by hunger, have either thrown bread outside the walls, or have given a calf grain to eat, and then allowed it to be taken, so that when it was killed, and being found full of grain, gave signs of an abundance which they do not have. On the other hand, excellent captains have used various methods to enfamish the enemy. Fabius allowed the Campanians to sow, so that they should lack that grain which they were sowing. Dionysius, when he was besieged at Reggio, feigned wanting to make an accord with them, and while it was being drawn, had himself provided with food, and then, when, by this method, had depleted them of grain, pressed them and starved them. Alexander the Great, when he wanted to capture Leucadia, captured all the surrounding castles, and allowed the men from them to take refuge in the city, and thus, by adding a great multitude, he starved them. As to assaults, it has been said that one ought to guard against the first onrush, with which the Romans often occupied many towns, assaulting them all at once from every side, and they called it attacking the city by its crown. As did Scipio when he occupied New Carthage in Spain. If this onrush is withstood, then only with difficulty will you be overcome. And even if it should occur that the enemy has entered inside the city by having forced the walls, even the small terraces give you some remedy if they are not abandoned. For many armies have, once they have entered into a town, been repulsed or slain. The remedy is that the townspeople keep themselves in high places, and fight them from their houses and towers. Which thing those who have entered in the city have endeavoured to win in two ways. The one, to open the gates of the city, and make a way for the townspeople by which they can escape in safety. The other, to send out a message by voice, signifying that no one would be harmed unless armed, and whoever would throw his arms on the ground they would pardon. Which thing has made the winning of many cities easy. In addition to this, cities are easy to capture if you fall on them unexpectedly, which you can do when you find yourself with your army far away, so that they do not believe that you either want to assault them, or that you can do it without your presenting yourself because of the distance from the place. whence, if you assault them secretly and quickly, it will almost always happen that you will succeed in reporting the victory. I unwillingly discuss those things which have happened in our times, as I would burden you with myself and my ideas, and I would not know what to say in discussing other things. None the less, concerning this matter, I cannot but cite the example of Cesare Borgia, called Duke Valentine, who, when he was at Nocera with his forces, under the pretext of going to harm Camerino, turned towards the state of Urbino, and occupied a state in one day, and without effort, which some other, with great time and expense, would barely have occupied. Those who are besieged must also guard themselves from the deceit and cunning of the enemy, and therefore the besieged should not trust anything which they see the enemy doing continuously, but always believe they are being done by deceit, and can change to injure them. When Domitus Calvinus was besieging a town, he undertook habitually to circle the walls of the city every day with a good part of his forces, whence the townspeople, believing he was doing this for exercise, lightened the guard. When Domitius became aware of this, he assaulted them and destroyed them. Some captains, when they heard beforehand that aid was coming to the besieged, have clothed their soldiers with the insignia of those who were to come, and having introduced them inside, have occupied the town. Cimon the Athenian one night set fire to a temple that was outside the town, whence, when the townspeople arrived to succour it, they left the town to the enemy to plunder. Some have put to death those who left the besieged castle to blacksmith or shoe horses, and redressing their soldiers with the clothes of the blacksmiths, who then surrendered the town to him. The ancient captains also employed various methods to despoil the garrisons of the towns they wanted to take. Scipio, when he was in Africa, and desiring to occupy several castles in which garrisons had been placed by Carthaginians, feigned several times wanting to assault them, but then from fear not only abstained, but drew away from them. Which Hannibal, believing to be true, in order to pursue him with a larger force and be able to attack him more easily, withdrew all the garrisons from them, and Scipio, becoming aware of this, sent Maximus, his captain, to capture them. Pyrrhus, when he was waging war in Sclavonia, in one of the chief cities of that country, where a large force had been brought in to garrison it, feigned to be desperate of being able to capture it, and turning to other places, caused her, in order to succour them, to empty herself of the garrison, so that it became easy to be captured. Many have polluted the water and diverted rivers to take a town, even though they did not then succeed. Sieges and surrenders are also easily accomplished by dismaying them, by pointing out an accomplished victory or new help which has come to their disfavour. The ancient captains sought to occupy towns by treachery, corrupting some inside, but have used different methods. Some have sent one of their men under the disguise of a fugitive, who gained authority and confidence with the enemy, which he afterwards used for his own benefit. Many by this means have learned the procedures of the guards, and through this knowledge have taken the town. Some have blocked the gate, so that it could not be locked, with a cart or a beam under some pretext, and by this means made the entry easy to the enemy. Hannibal persuaded one to give him a castle of the Romans, and that he should feign going on a hunt at night, to show his inability to go by day for fear of the enemy, and when he returned with the game, placed his men inside with it, and killing the guard, captured the gate. You also deceive the besieged by drawing them outside the town and distant from it, by feigning flight when they assault you. And many, among whom was Hannibal, have in addition allowed their quarters to be taken, in order to have the opportunity of placing them in their midst, and take the town from them. They deceive also by feigning departure, as did Phorminus the Athenian, who, having plundered the country of the Chalcidians, afterwards received their ambassadors, and filled their city with promises of safety and goodwill, who, as men of little caution, were shortly after captured by Phorminus. The besieged ought to look out for men whom they have among them that are suspect, but sometimes they may want to assure themselves of these by reward as well as by punishment. Marcellus, recognizing that Lucius Bancius Nolanus had turned to favour Hannibal, employed so much humanity and liberality towards him that from an enemy he made him a very good friend. The besieged ought to use more diligence in their guards when the enemy is distant than when he is near, and they ought to guard those places better which they think can be attacked less. For many towns have been lost when the enemy assaulted them on a side from which they did not believe they would be assaulted. And this deception occurs for two reasons: either because the place is strong and they believe it to be inaccessible, or because the enemy cunningly assaults him on one side with feigned uproars, and on the other silently with the real assaults. And therefore the besieged ought to have a great awareness of this, and above all, at all times, but especially at night, have good guards at the walls, and place there not only men but dogs, and keep them ferocious and ready, which by smell detect the presence of the enemy, and with their baying discover him. And in addition to dogs, it has been found that geese have also saved a city, as happened to the Romans when the Gauls besieged the capital. When Athens was besieged by the Spartans, Alcibiades, in order to see if the guards were awake, arranged that when a light was raised at night, all the guards should rise, and inflicted a penalty on those who did not observe it. Hisicratus, the Athenian, slew a guard who was sleeping, saying he was leaving him as he found him. Those who were besieged have had various ways of sending news to their friends, and in order not to send embassies by voice, wrote letters in cipher and concealed them in various ways. The ciphers are according to the desire of whoever arranges them. The method of concealment is varied. Some have written inside the scabbard of a sword. Others have put these letters inside raw bread, and then baked it, and gave it as food for him who brought it. Others have placed them in the most secret places of the body. Others have put them in the collar of a dog, known to him who brings it. Others have written ordinary things in a letter, and then have written with invisible ink between one line and another, which afterwards, by wetting or scalding, caused the letters to appear. This method has been very astutely observed in our time, where some, wanting to point out a thing which was to be kept secret to their friends who lived inside a town, and not wanting to trust it in person, sent communications written in the customary manner, but interlined, as I mentioned above, and had them hung at the gates of a temple, which were then taken and read by those who recognized them from the countersigns they knew. Which is a very cautious method, because whoever brings it can be deceived by you, and you do not run any danger. There are infinite other ways by which anyone by himself likewise can find and read them. But one writes with more facility to the besieged than the besieged do to friends outside, for the latter cannot send out such letters except by one who leaves the town under the guise of a fugitive, which is a doubtful and dangerous exploit when the enemy is cautious to a point. But as to those that are sent inside, he who is sent can, under many pretexts, go into the camp that is besieged, and from here await a convenient opportunity to jump into the town. But let us come to talk of present captures, and I say that if they occur when you are being fought in your city which is not arranged with ditches inside, as we pointed out a little while ago, when you do not want the enemy to enter by the breaks in the wall made by artillery, as there is no remedy for the break which it makes, it is necessary for you, while the artillery is battering, to dig a ditch inside the wall that is being hit, at least 30 arm lengths wide, and throw all the earth that is excavated towards the town, which makes embankments and the ditch deeper. And you must do this quickly, so that if the wall falls, the ditch will be excavated at least 5 or 6 arm lengths deep. While this ditch is being excavated, it is necessary that it be closed on each side by a blockhouse. And if the wall is so strong that it gives you time to dig the ditches and erect the blockhouses, that part which is battered comes to be stronger than the rest of the city, for such a repair comes to have the form that we gave to inside ditches. But if the wall is weak and does not give you time, then there is need to show virtue, and oppose them with armed forces, and with all your strength. This method of repair was observed by the Pisans when you went to besiege them, and they were able to do this because they had strong walls which gave them time, and the ground firm and most suitable for erecting ramparts and making repairs, which, had they not had this benefit, would have been lost. It would always be prudent, therefore, first to prepare yourself, digging the ditches inside your city and throughout all the circuit, as we devised a little while ago, for in this case, as the defences have been made, the enemy is waited with leisure and safety. The ancients often occupied towns with tunnels in two ways. Either they dug a secret tunnel which came out inside the town, and through which they entered it, in the way in which the Romans took the city of Veii, or by tunnelling they undermined a wall and caused it to be ruined. This last method is more effective today, and causes cities located high up to be weaker, for they can be undermined more easily. And then, when the powder which ignites in an instant is placed inside those tunnels, it not only ruins the wall, but the mountains are opened, and the fortresses are entirely disintegrated into several parts. The remedy for this is to build on a plain, and make the ditch which girds your city so deep that the enemy cannot excavate further below it without finding water, which is the only enemy of these excavations. And even if you find a knoll within the town that you defend, you cannot remedy it otherwise than to dig many deep wells within your walls, which are as outlets to those excavations which the enemy might be able to arrange against it. Another remedy is to make an excavation opposite to where you learn he is excavating, which method readily impedes him, but is very difficult to foresee when you are besieged by a cautious enemy. Whoever is besieged, above all, ought to take care not to be attacked in times of repose, as after having engaged in battle, after having stood guard, that is, at dawn, the evening between night and day, and above all at dinner time, in which times many towns have been captured, and many armies ruined by those inside. One ought, therefore, to be always on guard with diligence on every side, and in good part well armed. End of Book 7, Part 1. Book 7, Part 2 of The Art of War. I do not want to miss telling you that what makes defending a city or an encampment difficult is to have to keep all the forces you have in them disunited. For the enemy, being able altogether to assault you at his discretion, you must keep every place guarded on all sides, and thus he assaults you with his entire force, and you defend it with part of yours. The besieged can also be completely overcome, while those outside cannot unless repulsed. Whence many who have been besieged, either in their encampment or in a town, although inferior in strength, have suddenly issued forth with all their forces, and have overcome the enemy. Marcellus did this at Nola, and Caesar did this in Gaul, when his encampment, being assaulted by the great number of Gauls, and seeing he could not defend it without having to divide these forces into several parts, and unable to stay within the stockade with the driving attack of the enemy, opened the encampment on one side, and turning to that side with all his forces, attacked them with such fury and with such virtue that he overcame and defeated them. The constancy of the besieged has also often displeased and dismayed the besieger. And when Pompey was affronting Caesar, and Caesar's army was suffering greatly from hunger, some of his bread was brought to Pompey, who, seeing it made of grass, commanded it not to be shown to his army, in order not to frighten it, seeing what kind of enemies he had to encounter. Nothing gave the Romans more honor in the war against Hannibal as their constancy. For in whatever more inimical and adverse fortune, they never asked for peace, and never gave any sign for fear. Rather, when Hannibal was around Rome, those fields on which he had situated his quarters were sold at a higher price than they would ordinarily have been sold in other times. And they were so obstinate in their enterprise that to defend Rome they did not leave off attacking Capua, which was being besieged by the Romans at the same time Rome was being besieged. I know that I have spoken to you of many things which you have been able to understand and consider by yourselves. None the less, I have done this, as I also told you today, to be able to show you through them the better kind of training, and also to satisfy those, if there should be any, who had not had the opportunity to learn as you have. Nor does it appear to me there is anything left for me to tell you, other than some general rules, with which you should be very familiar, which are these: what benefits the enemy harms you, and what benefits you harms the enemy. Whoever is more vigilant in observing the designs of the enemy in war, and ensures much hardship in training his army, will incur fewer dangers, and can have greater hope for victory. Never lead your soldiers into an engagement unless you are assured of their courage, know they are without fear, and are organized, and never make an attempt unless you see they hope for victory. It is better to defeat the enemy by hunger than with steel. In such victory fortune counts more than virtue. No proceeding is better than that which you have concealed from the enemy until the time you have executed it. To know how to recognize an opportunity in war and take it benefits you more than anything else. Nature creates few men brave. Industry and training makes many. Discipline in war counts for more than fury. If some on the side of the enemy desert to come to your service, if they be loyal, they will always make you a great acquisition. For the forces of the adversary diminish more with the loss of those who flee than those who are killed, even though the name of the fugitives is suspect to the new friends and odious to the old. It is better in organizing an engagement to reserve great aid behind the front line than to spread out your soldiers to make a greater front. He is overcome with difficulty who knows how to recognize his forces and those of the enemy. The virtue of the soldiers is worth more than a multitude, and the sight is often of more benefit than virtue. New and speedy things frighten armies, while the customary and slow things are esteemed little by them. You will therefore make your army experienced, and learn the strength of a new enemy by skirmishes before you come to an engagement with him. Whoever pursues a routed enemy in a disorganized manner does nothing but become vanquished from having been a victor. Whoever does not make provisions necessary to live or eat is overcome without steel. Whoever trusts more in cavalry than in infantry, or more in infantry than in cavalry, must settle for the location. If you want to see whether any spy has come into the camp during the day, have no one go to his quarters. Change your proceeding when you become aware that the enemy has foreseen it. Counsel with many on the things you ought to do, and confer with few on what you do afterwards. When soldiers are confined to their quarters, they are kept there by fear or punishment. Then, when they are led by war, they are led by hope and reward. Good captains never come to an engagement unless necessity compels them or the opportunity calls them. Act so your enemies do not know how you want to organize your army for battle, and in whatever way you organize them, arrange it so that the first line can be received by the second and by the third. In a battle, never use a company for some other purpose than what you have assigned it to, unless you want to cause disorder. Accidents are remedied with difficulty unless you quickly take the facility of thinking. Men, steel, money, and bread are the sinews of war, but of these four the first two are more necessary, for men and steel can find money and bread, but money and bread do not find men and steel. The unarmed rich man is the prize of the poor soldier. Accustom your soldiers to despise delicate living and luxurious clothing. This is as much as occurs to me generally to remind you, and I know I could have told you of many other things in my discussion, for example, how and in how many ways the ancients organized their ranks, how they dressed, and how they trained in many other things, and to give you many other particulars, which I have not judged necessary to narrate, as much because you are able to see them, as because my intention has not been to show you in detail how the ancient army was created, but how an army should be organized in these times, which should have more virtue than they now have. Whence it does not please me to discuss the ancient matters further than those I have judged necessary to such an introduction. I know I should have enlarged more on the cavalry, and also on naval warfare, for whoever defines the military says that it is an army on land and on the sea, on foot and on horseback. Of naval matters I will not presume to talk, not because of not being informed, but because I should leave the talk to the Genoese and Venetians, who have made much study of it, and have done great things in the past. Of the cavalry I also do not want to say anything other than what I have said above, this part being, as I said, less corrupted. In addition to this, if the infantry, who are the nerve of the army, are well organized, of necessity it happens that good cavalry be created. I would only remind you that whoever organizes the military in his country so as to fill the quota of cavalry should make two provisions: the one, that he should distribute horses of good breed throughout his countryside, and accustom his men to make a round-up of fillies, as you do in this country with calves and mules. The other, so that the round-up men find a buyer, I would prohibit anyone to keep mules who did not keep a horse, so that whoever wanted to keep a mount only would be constrained to keep a horse. And in addition, none should be able to dress in silk except whoever keeps a horse. I understand this arrangement has been done by some princes of our times, and to have resulted in an excellent cavalry being produced in their countries in very brief time. About other things, how much should be expected from the cavalry, I will go back to what I have said to you today, and to that which is the custom. Perhaps you will also desire to learn what parts a captain ought to have. In this I will satisfy you in a brief manner, for I would not knowingly select any other man than one who should know how to do all those things we have discussed today. And these would still not be enough for him if he did not know how to find them out by himself, for no one without imagination was ever very great in his profession, and if imagination makes for honour in other things, it will above all honour you in this one. And it is to be observed that every creation, even though minor, is celebrated by the writers, as is seen where they praised Alexander the Great, who, in order to break camp more secretly, did not give the signal with the trumpet, but with a hat on the end of a lance. He is also praised for having ordered his soldiers, when coming to battle with the enemy, to kneel with the left knee, so that they could more strongly withstand the attack of the enemy, which not only gave him victory, but also so much praise that all the statues erected in his honour show him in that pose. But as it is time to finish this discussion, I want to return to the subject, and so in part escape that penalty which in this town custom decrees for those who do not return. If you remember well, Cosimo, you said to me that I was, on the one hand, an exalter of antiquity and a censurer of those who do not imitate them in serious matters, and on the other hand, in matters of war, in which I worked very hard, I did not imitate them. You were unable to discover the reason. To that I replied that men who want to do something must first prepare themselves to know how to do it, in order to be able afterwards to do it when the occasion permits it. Whether or not I would know how to bring the army to the ancient ways, I would rather you be the judge, who have heard me discuss on this subject at length. Whence you have been able to know how much time I have consumed on these thoughts, and I also believe you should be able to imagine how much desire there is in me to put them into effect, which you can guess if I was ever able to do it, or if ever the opportunity was given to me. Yet to make you more certain, and for my greater justification, I would like also to cite you the reasons, and in part will observe what I promised you, to show you the ease and the difficulty that are present in such imitation. I say to you, therefore, that no activity among men today is easier to restore to its ancient ways than the military. but for those only who are princes of so large a state they are able to assemble 15 or 20,000 young men from their subjects. On the other hand, nothing is more difficult than this to those who do not have such a convenience. And because I want you to understand this part better, you have to know that captains praised are of two kinds. The one includes those who, with an army well ordered through its own natural discipline, have done great things, such as were the greater part of the Roman citizens, and others who have led armies who have not had any hardship in maintaining them good, and to see to it they were safely led. The other includes those who not only had to overcome the enemy, but before they came to this, had been compelled to make their army good and well ordered, and who without doubt deserve greater praise than those others merited who, with an army which was naturally good, have acted with so much virtue. Such as these were Pelopidas, Epaminondas, Tullus Hostilius, Philip of Macedonia, father of Alexander, and Cyrus, king of the Persians, and Gracchus the Roman. All these had first to make the army good, and then fight with it. All of these were able to do so as much by their prudence as by having subjects capable of being directed in such practices. Nor would it have been possible for any of them to accomplish any praiseworthy deed, no matter how good and excellent they might have been, should they have been in an alien country, full of corrupt men and not accustomed to sincere obedience. It is not enough, therefore, in Italy, to govern an army already trained, but it is necessary first to know how to do it, and then how to command it. And of these there need to be those princes who, because they have a large state and many subjects, have the opportunity to accomplish this. Of whom I cannot be one, for I have never commanded, nor can I command except armies of foreigners, and men obligated to others and not to me. Whether or not it is possible to introduce into those princes some of the things we discuss today, I want to leave to your judgment. Would I make one of those soldiers who practice today carry more arms than is customary, and in addition food for 2 or 3 days and a shovel? Should I make him dig, or keep many hours every day under arms in feigned exercises, so that in real battles afterwards he would be of value to me? Would they abstain from gambling, lasciviousness, swearing, and insolence, which they do daily? Would they be brought to so much discipline, obedience, and respect that a tree full of apples, which should be found in the midst of an encampment, would be left intact, as has happened many times in the ancient armies? What can I promise them by which they will respect, love, or fear me, when, with the war ended, they no longer must come to me for anything? Of what can I make them ashamed who are born and brought up without shame? By what deity or saints do I make them take an oath? By those they adore, or by those they curse? I do not know any whom they adore, but I well know that they curse them all. How can I believe they will observe the promises to those men for whom they show their contempt hourly? How can those who depreciate God have reverence for men? What good customs, therefore, is it possible to instil in such people? And if you should tell me the Swiss and the Spaniards are good, I should confess they are far better than the Italians. But if you will note my discussion, and the ways in which both proceed, you will see that there are still many things among the Swiss and Spaniards to bring them up to the perfection of the ancients. And the Swiss have been good from their natural customs, for the reasons I have told you today, and the Spaniards from necessity. For when they fight in a foreign country, it seems to them they are constrained to win or die, and as no place appeared to them where they might flee, they became good. But it is a goodness defective in many parts, for there is nothing good in them except that they are accustomed to wait the enemy up to the point of the pike and of the sword. Nor would there be anyone suitable to teach them what they lack, and much less anyone who does not speak their language. But let us turn to the Italians, who, because they have not wise princes, have not produced any good army, and because they did not have the necessity that the Spaniards had, have not undertaken it by themselves, so that they remain the shame of the world. And the people are not to blame, but their princes are, who have been castigated and by their ignorance have received a just punishment, ignominiously losing the state, and without any show of virtue. Do you want to see if what I tell you is true? Consider how many wars have been waged in Italy from the passage of King Charles of France until today. And wars usually make men warlike and acquire reputations. These, as much as they have been great and cruel, so much more have caused its members and its leaders to lose reputation. This necessarily points out that the customary orders were not and are not good, and there is no one who knows how to take up the new orders. Nor do you ever believe that reputation will be acquired by Italian arms except in the manner I have shown, and by those who have large states in Italy, for this custom can be instilled in men who are simple, rough, and your own, but not to men who are malignant, have bad habits, and are foreigners. And a good sculptor will never be found who believes he can make a beautiful statue from a piece of poorly shaped marble, even though it may be a rough one. Our Italian princes, before they tasted the blows of the Ultramontane wars, believed it was enough for them to know what was written, think of a cautious reply, or write a beautiful letter, show wit and promptness in his sayings and in his words, know how to weave a deception, ornament himself with gems and gold, sleep and eat with greater splendour than others, keep many lascivious persons around, conduct himself avariciously and haughtily towards his subjects, become rotten with idleness, hand out military ranks at his will, express contempt for anyone who may have demonstrated any praiseworthy manner, want their words should be the responses of oracles. Nor were these little men aware that they were preparing themselves to be the prey of anyone who assaulted them. From this, then, in the year 1494, there arose the great frights, the sudden flights, and the miraculous losses, and those most powerful states of Italy were several times sacked and despoiled in this manner. But what is worse is that those who remained persist in the same error, and exist in the same disorder, and they do not consider that those who held the state anciently had done all those things we discussed, and that they concentrated on preparing the body for hardships, and the mind not to be afraid of danger. Whence it happened that Caesar, Alexander, and all those excellent men and princes were first among the combatants, went around on foot, and even if they did lose their state, wanted also to lose their lives, so that they lived and died with virtue. And if they, or part of them, could be accused of having too much ambition to rule, there never could be found in them any softness or anything to condemn which makes men delicate and cowardly. If these things were to be read and believed by these princes, it would be impossible that they would not change their way of living, and their countries not change in fortune. And as in the beginning of our discussion you complained of your organization, I tell you, if you had organized it as we discussed above, and it did not give a good account for itself, then you would have reason to complain. But if it is not organized and trained as I have said, the army can have reason to complain of you, who have made an abortion and not a perfect organization. The Venetians also and the Duke of Ferrara began it, but did not pursue it, which was due to their fault and not of their men. And I affirm to now that any of them who have states in Italy today will begin in this way, he will be the lord higher than any other in this province, and it will happen to his state as happened to the kingdom of the Macedonians, which, coming under Philip, who had learned the manner of organizing the armies from Epaminondas the Theban, became, with these arrangements and practices, while the rest of Greece was in idleness and attending to reciting comedies, so powerful that in a few years he was able to occupy it completely, and leave such a foundation to his son that he was able to make himself prince of the entire world. Whoever disparages these thoughts, therefore, if he be a prince, disparages his principality, and if he be a citizen, his city. And I complain of nature, which either ought to make me a recognizer of this, or ought to have given me the faculty of being able to pursue it. Nor, even today, when I am old, do I think I have the opportunity. And because of this, I have been liberal with you, who, being young and qualified, when the things I have said please you, could, at the proper time, in favour of your princes, aid and counsel them. I do not want you to be afraid or mistrustful of this, because this country appears to be destined to resuscitate the things that are dead, as has been observed with poetry, painting, and sculpture. But as for waiting for me, because of my years, do not rely on it. And truly, if in the past fortune had conceded to me what would have sufficed for such an enterprise, I believe I would, in a very brief time, have shown the world how much the ancient institutions were of value, and without doubt I would have enlarged it with glory, or would have lost it without shame. End of Book 7, Part 2. End of The Art of War, by Niccolò Machiavelli. Read by Clive Catterall.